I'm delighted to be chairing this panel this evening of amazing artists, and we're all broadcasting from London, Brooklyn, Providence and Glasgow tonight. And I'm going to introduce the three artists, but what I want you to think about is if you've got any questions that you want me to pose to the artists after they've done their talks and their presentations, if you could just put all your questions into the chat and I'll try and get them to answer as many as possible. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Tayo Adekunle, Stacey Tyrell and Annu Palakunnathu Matthew tonight, and thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this event. I should also add that tonight's event, and you'll have all the details, Reclaiming the Colonial Days. It's part of the Black History Month programme, but as we all know, and I'm sure we're all in agreement, Black History happens all year round. It just so happens that this event coincided with Black History Month, so we used it as a good opportunity as a showcase. But these three amazing artists work all year round, so please be mindful. Okay, so Tayo, do you want to start the proceed off?
Yeah. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So hi everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you to Street Level Photoworks for inviting me to this event. So my name's Tayo Adekunle. I'm a photographer who recently graduated from Edinburgh College of Art, and now I'm based in London. My work explores the subjects of race, gender, and sexuality, and I often use archives or historical imagery in my work, either through my research or as part of the piece directly. I tend to explore the relationship between past and present, and so historical imagery helps me to show how those past images relate to the present day. Since a lot of my work is about racial or colonial history, it's important for me to be able to refer to that historical imagery to help put my own work and the subject matter into context. The images I use help to illustrate how certain beliefs and opinions that were established throughout history have been maintained over time. So this image is from a series called Venus Noir. It's a collection of images which responds to different aspects of how Black women are seen and portrayed historically and in a contemporary context. So the project sort of started with me wanting to address how I'd not seen many Black people in artwork around museums and galleries, and if I did see any, they usually held a secondary role. I used the figure of Venus throughout the series to explore different ways that Black women were seen sexually. So Venus is a figure of beauty, particularly in the Western world, and she's often shown as white and slender with long flowing hair, and so she sort of upholds a standard of beauty that's inaccessible to many different people. Often Black women are viewed as hypersexual, but undesirable at the same time. So I wanted to address how the image of the Venus was not associated with the image of a Black woman. There was also the issue of sexualization that occurs in depictions of women, especially since I was referencing art historical paintings, particularly nude paintings. It was an issue that I wanted to tackle and address in my work, where I'd need to address two levels of sexualization. So sort of the sexualization of me as a woman, and then the extra layer of me being sexualized as a Black woman. The project involved a lot of unlearning of things, like measuring myself against Eurocentric standards of beauty. So once I'd recognized that beauty doesn't only come from whiteness, I found a lot within my body and the bodies of other Black women to celebrate. For instance, my natural Afro hair is used and shown throughout the series. Many Black people are taught to straighten their hair, as natural hair can often be perceived as messy or ugly. And I wanted to counter that narrative and show how and why natural hair needs to be embraced and celebrated. So I was inspired by many different reclining nude paintings, including Manet's Olympia. So I also used overdrawn red lips throughout the series, which was a nod to blackface and minstrelsy and the character of Jim Crow. Like many other blackface caricatures, Jim Crow embodies many stereotypes of Black people, and I wanted to nod to blackface culture within these photographs, especially because it's an issue that we still deal with today. So blackface characters traditionally depict Black people as stupid or clumsy or ugly, just like sort of any negative stereotype. So for me, using the red lips, for me, it sort of rejected those stereotypes as well as acknowledging them. Excuse me. So this is from my series Reclamation of the Exposition. It was my graduate project. It explores and responds to the fetishization, commodification, and sexualization of the Black female body through the lens of colonial photography and the display of Black bodies at World's Fairs and in natural history museums. And it continues my exploration of how the Black body is often ridiculed and turned into a spectacle. I was inspired by many different examples of colonial photography that I found, in particular Prince Roland Napoleon Bonaparte's collection, which was titled Boscheman et Hottentot. So in a lot of the images that I'd found, women were often left unnamed with a vague and sometimes inaccurate description of their nationality. They usually photographed naked and in a way that emphasized that nakedness. So I'd taken poses from colonial photographs that I'd seen through my research and adapted them for my work. I saw quite a few reclining images which had obvious sexual connotations, which seemed inappropriate for this sort of ethnographic work. However, I learned how those images were circulated as pornographic postcards. And so it became clear that they were sort of only being disguised as educational and ethnographic imagery. I also learned about anthropometric style photography, which was a method that was developed as a substitute to the more rigid style of ethnographic photography, which involved photographing individuals in uncomfortable poses to allow measurement and analysis and comparison of bodies. Because people were being put in such awkward poses, they became a lot less cooperative, understandably. And so anthropometric style photography was developed. This method involved group photographs where bodies were arranged so that frontal, side profile, and rear views, as well as squatting and seated poses, were available within one frame, so that direct comparison between the bodies could be made. So these images are from my artifact series, which was sort of a mini series within the Reclamation of Exposition series. It explored all the same things, but I directly used the source material that inspired the project so that people could see firsthand the images that I was referring to. I knew I wanted to use some archival imagery directly, but I'd really struggled to find images that I could use. So many museums which I knew had the types of images that I wanted to look at, I knew they had them in their archives, but they hadn't digitalized a lot of resources that related to colonial history and that showed Black people. But I found this series from Bonaparte's collection. I was interested in how the images were staged in a way to make them seem authentic. So there's like cloths in the background of the images and on the ground that the women are stood on, which suggests some sort of photo shoot type scene. And on the website that I found the images, the location of the photographs is listed as Africa, but these were actually taken in the Garden of Plants in Paris. So these women weren't even being photographed in the country that they came from. So these images are another example of how the exotic was often staged in a way that appealed and excited European audiences. The women are posed in different ways, which emphasize certain sexual features. I placed myself in these images to show how the ways that their bodies and bodies like theirs were treated in the past has informed the way that Black women's bodies like my own are treated today. I really wanted to reclaim these images and address the lack of agency of the women in the photographs. So this is one of my most recent pieces. I've been really enjoying exploring elements of Yoruba culture. This most recent work looks at one of the Yoruba orishas called Yemoja. So they're a motherly orisha and a water spirit with associations with the moon, and they're known for healing and taking away their children's pain. She's often linked with the figure of Virgin Mary in South American and Afro-Cuban practices, which shows how Yoruba culture and religion has spread and survived through slavery. So the piece explores different aspects of the slave trade, including Britain's involvement through materials that they used and manufactured. So I created my own versions of manila, which are the gold things that are circling around my head. They were used as currency in the trade. And then I also created my own elephant tusks, which were transported by slaves. I'd also photographed some sugarcane, which they had in Edinburgh Botanical Gardens, which was farmed in South America, primarily in Brazil. So my relationship with this piece is quite complex, as it's like a negotiation of inherited trauma and grief. And I used Yemoja as a figure of comfort within the work. However, I think nowadays I tend to view the work more as a celebration of Yoruba culture and my reconnection with it. Though the subject matter is very heavy, it's been very beneficial for me to be able to work through those feelings whilst also learning about my history and cultural history. Thank you. I think it's Stacy next. I'll just stop sharing.
Okay. All right. So before I jump into my work, I just wanted to tell everybody a little bit about my background and sort of where I'm coming at my work from. So I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, and I'm a first generation Canadian. So that means that both of my parents are from the island of Nevis originally, but then I'm the first generation to be born in Canada. Nevis is a small island in the Leeward Island chain, and it's about 38 miles square. It has a population of about 11,000. Historically, it was important because it was a hub for the slave, cotton, and sugar trades of the 16th and 17th centuries. And at one point, it was also the headquarters for the Royal Africa Company, which meant that other people had to come from the different islands to purchase slaves at its slave markets. It's also one of the many islands in the Caribbean that at some point in history was either held by the Spanish, the French, or the English. And respectively, that's where it was also a place where we had slaves vastly outnumber the whites who were either there as indentured servants or as plantation owners. And so that gives you like an idea of the scale of production. Also, it was the birthplace of Alexander Hamilton, who appears on the American $10 bill. The first body of work I'm going to share with you is a series that I call Backward Blood. Now, I wanted a title that sort of referenced the two parts that I know of my heritage, that being the Caribbean and also Scotland. So my understanding of the term Bakra or Bukra, it's an archaic Caribbean slang from West Africa. And basically it refers to either like a white person in particular, one that's in a position of power or authority. And then the word blood, I believe, is a Scotch word for the blood of men, animals, and as well as kin. So when I was thinking of a title for the series, I just wanted something that immediately sort of triggered referencing those two cultures. So the main motivation for the series, before I actually share the images with you, so as a child, I went to predominantly white schools where often on occasions I would listen to my classmates sort of proudly lay claim to their Scottish, Irish, and English heritage, while I would silently sort of acknowledge my own. I would have times where even on the odd occasion, like where I would mention that, you know, like one of my great grandfathers is from Scotland. I would have the other children call me a liar, basically, because their sort of basic understanding of, I guess, like how races and cultures worked was that, you know, like what you see is sort of what you get. But in truth, it's like there's many parts of my family that on both sides, that there's people from Scotland, England, Ireland, and also Western Europe. And so like as an adult, you know, the odd time that like I would bring this up, I could see that, you know, it's like certain groups of people in particular, let's say like white people, would feel a little uncomfortable because by mentioning that part of my heritage, it sort of, you know, like it triggers this very uncomfortable connection to this series of like brutal African slavery, which is very much like where my family is from. So also part of my practice, I'm very research and history heavy. So I decided to use DNA ancestry technology as a resource for the work that I create. When I first started, the only thing available was from the National Geographic Company. It cost $200 for them to basically tell me that I have a female African ancestor. But as time has progressed, the technology has gotten better, and there's more in-depth analysis. So also, I feel that this series not only is an exploration, let's say, like of how I perceive myself, but also my preconceptions and perceptions of, say, like what would be deemed whiteness and, say, the inherent Eurocentric constructs that are created within Western society. So because really it doesn't allow for like room where the members of most post-colonial societies are basically hybrids of the different populations that sort of settled in these places, whether that was forcefully or through immigration. So what I decided to do was basically like change one of my main physical characteristics in order to see like what else visually would come through visually, because often human perception, it sort of stops mainly with skin color. So like that's where I'm assigned an identity within the mind of whoever it is that happens to be looking at me. So I figured that by changing one of my major physical characteristics and then making subtle tweaks, that this would also further the point of the project. I also like to reference systems like the casta system or the encomienda system, which is found in the Spanish world, where basically it was a system of racial classification that was used in order to figure out who would pay tribute to the Spanish crown, as well as it dictated everything from who could own land, what types of clothing you could wear, and also who you could marry. And you still see echoes of that in many societies in the Caribbean, Central and Latin America to this day. So my process is basically that I try to do as much in camera. I change my appearance mainly through makeup, and I work with an assistant, but predominantly I do everything myself. She helps me sort of get the spots that I can't reach, and also then just helps me like with the camera work and whatnot. And as an overall experience, I do have to say it's a very odd thing to sort of alter your appearance so much that when you sort of hit this point where you're almost finished and you're looking at yourself in the mirror and you sort of have this stranger coming back, for me at least, I feel that I'm sort of co-opting this sort of white gaze that I'm constantly under, just as a Black person in North America or in the Western world in general. So the images that I've created, like it sort of gives me an opportunity to sort of play around with this gaze, as well as sort of create this interpretation of the relatives or ancestors that I feel are out there. So these are some of the images that I was able to create. So as you can probably see, like a lot of this perception say that I have, like I'm sort of making the assumption that most of the people that I would be related to are upper middle class people, but more than likely they're just like regular working class people that are out there. And the next body of work that I'd like to share with you is one that I titled Pour la Victoire. And basically, this is where I wanted to explore sort of the female allegory that is often used as the embodiment of nationhood for colonizing Western countries in particular. Because a lot of these figures, they present like a very particular presentation of an ideal white womanhood of a particular period in time. These figures are usually virginal, and they're demure, and they're nobly highlighting the path to enlightenment and victory for the country that she represents. It's a figure that's often used in propaganda to rally troops and patriots to fight on her behalf. Her gaze is usually neutral, and it's often looking upwards and towards this glorious manifest destiny to which she is guiding her subjects. She's often magnanimous and in her demeanor, and is permeated with this assumed cultural superiority, and also as well as bringing progress in civilization. You can also see this here. On the left, we have Colombia with her arms reaching out to embrace, but really it's sort of like, who is it really that she's choosing to embrace? On the right, we have a painting here of Manifest Destiny, where it's a pretty heavy-handed allegory, I think, where you see this figure sort of bringing like pioneers in technology and literal light over this dark landscape, and that you see Native Americans running with animals in fear away from this impending change. And then also you have figures like Marianne or Liberty leading the people in France. So why it is that I wanted to explore these sort of figures is that my family is part of what was called the Windrush generation, where after the end of World War II, they were recruited to come over to England and help her rebuild. A lot of them even, like fought in these wars. So my grandparents, and they boarded these ships as teens and young adults, and they were going off to make a better life in a foreign land. And they felt that because they were British educated and they were taught in the British system, that they would be sort of welcomed with open arms. They were taught their entire lives that they were proud British citizens. And my father used to often recite Rule Britannia, proclaiming that Britons shall never be slaves. But, like there's a great irony in that, considering the fact that you have the literal ancestors of African slaves being taught these words. And, the person that wrote that song probably had no intention or could not have the foresight to see that these same people, like these slaves, would then immigrate to the shores of the motherland to help rebuild this society. Now, I think it's important to recognize that when they got there, like they were not accepted with open arms, and that there's sort of like this paradox that's embedded in the relationship of any colonial power and its former and current subjects. They arrived and automatically they were sort of assigned this identity as being other and also being rejected. You can see this even blatantly with signs here where it says, sorry, no coloreds, or, keep Britain white. So these figures in the series are sort of my attempt to sort of reconcile what clearly, like what lies beneath these symbols of nationhood and to whom they're actually intended. So we have Britannia, who's based off of the warrior goddess Boudica. Hispania, I'm going to say this wrong, the Effigia, Portugal. The Stella d'Italia, Marianne, and the Dutch Maiden. Canadiana, and Colombia. And just to wrap up, just to briefly speak about like what it is that I'm sort of working on now. I'm still very fascinated with historical archive imagery, painting, but then also exploring this sort of interplay between the presentation of visually and historically of white womanhood as well as Black womanhood, and how it's sometimes or oftentimes used historically as sort of like an ornamental decoration within a painting. This is also one that's always fascinated me. It was originally in Kenwood House, but it now lives in Scone Palace in Perth in Scotland. And here you see Elizabeth Dido Bell on the left, and then that's her cousin, Lady Elizabeth Murray, and they live together in the same household. So with those bodies of work, you can see like where I'm just beginning to sort of flesh out this interplay with the figures, and you know, we'll sort of see where it goes. And that's my time. So I'd like to hand it over to Annu now.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. And I see a lot of threads that interweave between all our different bodies of work. And I'd like to thank Arpita and Malcolm for the invitation today. I'm going to dive right into my work. The first one I'm going to show is an Indian from India. And it's about the confusion between my type of Indian and the indigenous American. And all this stems from the fact that I was born in the United Kingdom, grew up in India, and now have lived in the United States for over 20 years. So the amalgamation of the accents creates a lot of confusion. And so when people ask me where I'm from, and if I say Providence, Rhode Island, they say, no, 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 where are you really from? And if I say Indian, I often have to clarify that I'm an Indian from India. All this confusion started because in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Looking for India, he found North America instead, and that's caused a lot of confusion. So here on the left, you have a red Indian, and on the right, a brown Indian. I take 19th century photographs of Native Americans and pair them with self-portraits. My goal is to reverse the gaze and reconsider historical narratives and those outside of the majority. The work also explores the lingering effects of our colonial past. Through the work, I also explore the strange similarities between the two British colonial photography histories. During the late 19th century, several volumes of the book Tribes of India were published as an effort to categorize the different populations within the vast human fabric of India. As I became more aware of the inherent problem in the power relations between the photographer and subject, I decided to turn the camera on myself to negate that power relationship and join hands with the indigenous American to challenge the viewer's gaze. So on the left here, you have a noble savage, and on the right is a savage noble. So some of the images are by the most well-known photographer of the indigenous Americans, Edward Curtis. Here is American Indian with war paint and Indian with war paint. But in the images shown, especially of myself, the clothes are assembled outside of the original context and are not authentic Indian dress. I'm playing on how Curtis contrived the posing and dress of some of his subjects to make them look more, quote, exotic, unquote, or more Indian. This is similar to what some photographers did in India, and this is documented in the book Camera Indica by Christopher Pinney. So I'm going to jump a number of years to open wound stories of partition. For over a decade, I worked on this body of work. And it's about the partition of British India, which happened when the British left the Indian subcontinent in 1947. The country was split into India, East, and West Pakistan, which became Bangladesh. The resulting partition left over 15 million people displaced in just 3 months, and over 1 million died. In my project, I tell the stories of the children of partition who are now in their 80s and 90s. My aim is to collaborate with my subjects to create work that is accessible to a larger audience by using their family photographs. What happened to them should not be lost to history. So I'm going to skip this one and go to the next one. What amazes me is that I walk into these strangers' homes and they open up to me. We initially bond by looking at their albums. This is one of the strengths of photography, the power to trigger memories and shared storytelling. When I started this project, I started in India. I was on a Fulbright fellowship, but since then I've expanded it to include the stories from Pakistan and Bangladesh. And so this is one of the stories from Pakistan. This is Abdul Halim's story. And I call these photo animations. My mother never told my father what happened. She said because he never asked. She never spoke about losing a child. My father said he didn't want to know how she was saved, as there was always a stigma about women who survived. My mother told my wife how my sister died. She was given a choice to choose between my sister or me, but couldn't make one. It was decided for her. I present the work in a hollowed out 1947 encyclopedia with an iPad mini inside. As Dr. Bhakirathimani pointed out, the act of hollowing out the book is a metaphor for the violence that happened during partition. And this is from a recent installation where the Indian stories and the Pakistani stories are in two separate books, side by side with a haunting video in the background. My decade-long work on partition led me to stumble on the story of the Indian soldiers who volunteered in World War II. I find it staggering that over 2.5 million Indians volunteered in World War II, yet their contributions are not included in India's national history, let alone global. The more I research, I discover how complicated the history is. Part of the complication is as to why these soldiers are not recognized includes the fact that they were fighting for their colonizer. But they did play a role in winning World War II. And through my work, I'm asking if space can be made for these soldiers' contributions along with the other historical players. For the Kochi Musri Biennale, I focused on the Italian campaign of World War II as the Indians played a critical role. This is a clip where I projected edited archival footage of the Indians from World War II in Italy onto their own gravestones in Italy. On the day of the Kochi Biennale opening, my friend sent me a photograph of her grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Gopal Chakravarti. And what I loved about this photograph is that, I don't come from a military family, but I could really relate to the image of him standing in his army fatigues in front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So for the last 1.5, 2 years, I was in India right before the pandemic, collecting family photographs of these 2.5 million Indians who volunteered for the British. I heard their stories from a range of people from different religions, castes, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And in the process, learned about their unheralded contributions. So what am I going to do with these photographs and stories? My role as an artist is to take that abstract number of 2.5 million Indians who fought in World War II and transform it into something tangible that people can wrap their heads around, and also understand the complexity of the history. So this exhibition just opened last week, where I have the names of the 87,000 Indians who died scrolling with those silhouettes, and it includes their professions, names, and the names of their parents and wives. And it also includes people who didn't necessarily have family photographs. The other thing that I've done is I've created 3D etched crystals of some of these family photographs, and again, edited some of the footage of the Indians fighting in all 3 theaters that plays on these dhotis that are hanging in the space. And here you can see a close-up of the 3D crystals. And this is a clip from the video that is projected.
My grandfather joined the army out of necessity to bring up his 9 siblings after their parents died. While posted in the Burma front during World War II, he injured his leg from a grenade explosion. Although doctors managed to remove the fragments of the grenade, they were unable to remove one piece of shell which was embedded in his bone.
So in closing, my multimedia installation also begs the question of who else is not acknowledged and helps shape new perspective. We're at a moment where memories and histories are being reevaluated and reconsidered in significant ways. Art can play a crucial role in shaping the politics of remembrance by pulling back the veil on forgotten histories. My objective is to leverage visual media to evaluate this narrative and integrate it into its historical and cultural legacy, to jolt the viewer out of their complacency, challenging how we have internalized narratives of World War II. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tayo, Stacy, and Annu, for 3 amazingly powerful presentations. Just a reminder to everyone who's here today, if you've got any questions, if you put them into the chat, and I can pose the questions to the artists. But just to kick things off, one of the things that really stood out for me is the fact that, as Annu pointed out, the 3 of you, your work, that there's similarity, in the history's threaded through. How do you feel seeing each other's work, and you're seeing that here you've got 3 artists here, all connecting your family narratives, your family history, the history around migration and colonisation. So, Tayo, do you want to go first? I'm curious to know how you feel about each other's work, what you felt, knowing that there's other people doing.
Well, first off, it's amazing to see. Both of your work is absolutely incredible. It's very encouraging to see, I think. Obviously, that other people are speaking about it, but also just, I think, being able to relate to the way that you're both working and the sort of threads of thought that go through the projects, and like I found myself nodding a lot from when you would do like presenting your work and out of agreement. So yeah, it's great to see. I think it's a nice feeling.
Yeah, and just to echo that, like for so long, and I'm sure we've all had these moments where you just feel like you're off working by yourself and sort of shouting out into the dark. And so like when you have somebody that is like you, that sort of answers back, and that you realize that, it's like we all sort of make these projects because they're sort of personally important to us, but then also because these themes need to be shared. It's like, it's really crazy that still like we've barely scratched the surface in having this discussed, and especially artistically. So it's always very exciting to see that all of us are sort of taking up this banner and we keep carrying it.
I would agree that I was nodding a lot, and it was also interesting how some of the words we were using were very, similar across all three. And the order of these presentations was random. I said I'm always nervous to go first, and so Tayo went first, and but I think each of them built on each other. And I love the fact that Stacy's ended with World War II, and it was like perfect in terms of my segue. So even though it was an accident, I think it worked out really, really well in terms of the threads really weaving together.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because one of the things that I always feel, even with my work, is you can feel really isolated and feel really lonely. And one of the things I always think is you might be by yourself, but you're actually not alone. And that was something that I felt when I was looking, watching your presentations, is just, well, it can be quite traumatic sometimes, some of the imagery. It's really, really important, actually, that what you're doing, and you're reclaiming that narrative, which I think makes it a really powerful statement. It makes me think that you might be doing stuff alone, but you're never by yourself when you see work like what yous are putting together. So I've got a comment here from a couple of members of the audience. So beautiful and powerful bodies of work, really important, with many layers of sensitivities. And that's what I think you've all done extremely well, which many culture and heritage institutions, for instance, could learn from, that sensitivity of the work that you do. Can I ask you about when you do present your work, what sort of feedback and comments do you get from the audiences? I'll say to Annu first.
Sure. I think one of the motivations of doing my work is to use my artwork to change perspectives and to make the viewer walk away saying, oh, wow, I didn't know that. I've got to reframe, my the way that I think things. And when that's the feedback that I get from people, then I guess I know that I'm doing my job.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my reaction.
The feedback you get. Stacey, what about you?
I would say for the most part, it's been pretty positive, though it seems to fall sort of into some main categories. And then in particular, not surprisingly, but surprisingly, say from, let's say like some Black audience members, there's this tendency to say that what it is that I'm choosing to discuss comes from some sort of deep-rooted self-hatred, because I'm choosing to sort of co-opt a gaze that I fall under, and then sort of don almost like a drag this, this physical persona in order to like discuss topics of heritage. And I sort of feel that when I get those types of criticism, really it's like, well, it's kind of proving a point, but then also that they're not necessarily fully understanding why it is that I'm doing that. Like it's very different. Me every day, like, it's like all the time, like people are, straightening their hair or getting a weave or donning blue contacts and all these types of sort of markers of European beauty. But then I'm using it as a tool to discuss heritage. And there are people that get upset by that.
And yeah, I think that's a major, powerful part of the work that you do. So as we were talking earlier before we came on, when people get upset, sometimes you kind of think that you're doing the right means you're doing it right, you know. Tayo, what about you? I mean, one of the things about your work that stood out for me also, because many years ago I did a lot of work looking at Black minstrelsy in Scotland. So what sort of feedback have you been getting about your work? Because I thought the way you reclaimed that was really fascinating, really interesting and powerful.
Yeah, I think it's the way I view my work is sort of similar to Annu's, that like I've a lot of the information that I've found has been through like academic readings and stuff, which uses a lot of really inaccessible language. So I started doing this work as a way for me to digest that information and to make that information accessible to other people and sort of give them like a visual cue to then be able to learn about certain histories and be able to go away and research it further if they wanted to. So knowing that people have seen my work and then have felt compelled to go do that, or even just like coming to talks like this and being able to hear me talk about like different parts of history, and knowing that like I'm sharing that information is absolutely like great.
No, it is. It's really important, and I always feel art is a great medium to actually tell these stories, and particularly in the way that you all centre your own experiences, your family's experiences, and your history in your work. I think really it is very educational, as well as you know the powerful aesthetics that you use. We've got a question from an audience member here who's wants to ask, can all the speakers talk about the role of healing in your work? So do you feel that that's part of the reclaiming of the narrative of this history? Do you find that quite healing? I'll go to Stacy first. I keep forgetting that we're on Zoom. I think we're just kind of chatting basically, so apologies for that. I keep forgetting, Stacy.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something incredibly cathartic about just making any of the work that I make. Like I predominantly make it for myself, knowing that, you know, the byproduct is that other people will see it and relate to it. So it's incredibly healing for me in order to be able to discuss these topics like in a visual sense.
You?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the way that I tend to make the work is just like digesting information that I've learned, particularly a lot of the time it's like obviously like horrible history, so making the work sort of exposes me to things that I guess I'd been taught as like a child, just like growing up as like being Black in England, learning to unlearn those things and learning to gain like a great appreciation for myself, for Blackness, for like Black community, and then learning about like my own culture. It is very healing. I think it's sort of, I'm just repairing what I guess could be described as almost like a damaged relationship. So yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I think the way, I was thinking of the word you used of healing, and I think to me, it's not a wound that I've inflicted on myself, it's a wound that's been inflicted on me. And so through my work, I want those people who've inflicted the wound to be much more aware of that and take responsibility for that. But I also think my later work has become a lot more collaborative with the partition work, but also the Indian soldiers. And I think for those families, it has been healing. In partition, we really haven't, when I was growing up in India, we never talked about partition. And to find out that 3 of my classmates' families went through it was really stunning. And I think when I was speaking to these 80-year-old people who hadn't spoken, some of them had never talked about it in their life, it was healing for them. And yeah, so I was more the conduit towards letting that history be more well known.
And I mean, I'm always fascinated about World War II, around looking at the people from around the empire who were involved in World War II, and it's basically because I'm a parent and the schools just teach World War II incessantly. Honestly, it's unbelievable how much it's taught, and yet the people we're talking about today are completely not, they're not included in that education at all. They're not included in that narrative, that story. And both Stacey and Annu, you touch on that in your work. It's which I think is really important when we think about the fact that people were invited to the UK to rebuild after the war, and that seems to be something that's forgotten about. How important do you feel, and this is to all three of you, that this history is taught from early years right through, to older generations? Because most people don't really know anything about this history, and obviously you have put a lot of effort in to do that research. How important do you think this should be part of mainstream education?
I mean, obviously, I think it should be, and that's why I'm doing the work. And if there's anyone out there who knows any South Asian people who fought in World War II in UK, I'd love to be in touch, because I'm still, working on the extended body of work. But obviously, I mean, I don't think I would be doing the work if I didn't think it was important to know about. And I think it explains some of the complexities of what is happening in contemporary politics.
Yes.
The ramifications of colonization and the partition of India.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's like imperative that it's taught, to be honest with you. There's like such a disconnect with, so like growing up, I always had this perception of like Black history was just like slavery over in America, which is not true, obviously. And like I was never taught about any Black figures in education at all at school, and so that is just a weird thing, just from like a personal perspective anyway. But for just like Black kids growing up in the UK, there is a serious disconnect between you being Black and then you also being British and what that means. But then also just in general, like people should know about this, because it is part of like Western history, and it's weird that it's not spoken about, because people are only getting like half an education at this point, really.
It is that disconnect, isn't it? Because our histories are threaded through. We're actually all connected through our history. And I think, Stacey, your thoughts on that, because I could clearly see that from your presentation also, like even my own heritage connection with you, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Like first of all, I just think that it needs to be taught to the point where we don't have to think about the fact that that is woven into the fabric of the story of these events. And, like there tends to be like a compartmentalization of like, at least like how it was taught to me, where you sort of like, there was World War I, tie that with a bow, and this precipitated this, and then this is how this was taught, and then that's it. And really, if I were to go off of what it was that I was taught, was that basically you had the Western powers, and then the Holocaust happened, and those are the only two things that you get out of World War II, let's say. And that not the fact that these battles sort of set the stage for our present situation even to this day, and how perpetually we're going through these cycles of like, especially living here in the United States, of waves of immigration, and even in Canada, waves of immigration and different events that sort of bring different groups of people to a country. And, like I've often said to people that it's like my family sort of, to a degree, had the luxury of being able to be recruited and choose to go over to England versus having to flee a conflict and literally grabbing everything that you can, and you just go and you never go back to where it is that you're from. And, even though it's sort of like, the narrative of the specifics sort of change, it's like the fundamental of it just doesn't, like it's something that we're constantly living with.
Yeah. One of the things, there's a great comment put in the thread here from one of the audience members. Thank you, Annu, Stacey and Tayo, incredible work, and so inspiring to hear you discuss your practices. more work like yours and by artists of colour still needs to be shown in museums and galleries. Totally agree with that. Work that deals with and confront the complex histories of colonialism. Can you discuss your experiences as exhibiting artists exploring these themes? Stacey, do you want to start?
Yeah. So what I find really interesting is that because I'm in North America, but I'm sort of discussing like sort of themes of Britishness and these types of things, that my work doesn't really get shown in this part of the world. It more tends to be over in England. For some reason, Germany, the work really resonates over there. So that can be like a little frustrating because, like I don't fit within this sort of canon of like African-American, like the African-American framework and that narrative and how that plays into sort of like this overall history of colonialism. So that's mainly the difficulty that I find.
Annu, do you want to tell us?
Sure. And thanks, Arpita, for that comment. I find a similar situation where, even though I've lived most of my life in the United States, I'm not considered as an American artist. And I'm not British either because I was born there, but I left when I was 10. And so I'm considered Indian, but Indians don't consider me as an Indian artist. So I fall between the cracks in terms of that. So it's something, and I think one of the things I've consciously have started trying not to do is just being in, Indian shows, because then you get constricted by that box. So that has been my experience as an artist.
Tayo?
I mean, my experience is kind of minimal. I graduated into a pandemic. But the one thing that I have noticed is that just seems to, I think, I also graduated with the resurgence of BLM. So there is a lot more conversation around the types of things that I'm talking about, which is really great to see. And it also means that I'm seeing a lot more Black artists being given a platform to speak on these things. Yeah, I don't actually have that much experience.
But you did do an exhibition in Street Level in 2020, didn't you, for the Future Proof, which is something everyone who's here today can actually look at Street Level's website and see some more of Tayo's work from that was exhibited in 2020. It was very, very powerful. Someone mentioned to me, do any of you know Maud Salter's work? Yeah, because we could always get Malcolm at Street Level to send you some information about Maud Salter. I can't believe that's us finished. That just went by so quickly. I wish we could stay on and chat for a bit longer, but I'm very conscious of time because we're just about to wrap up. Have you got any final points or comments that you want to make? Before we're just about to wrap up, is there any comment? Is there anything that you are burning to say before we finish that I've not gave you time or room to say?
I'm good.
I guess just thank you. Thank you for giving us this platform.
I feel extremely privileged to be present here tonight with you, to be part of this audience, seeing the presentation of your work. So thank you very much for all coming together. One of the best presentations of work I've seen the past 6 months, I've got to say. It was so engaging, and thank you very much for taking part in tonight. And I look forward to us actually meeting in person at some point in the future. Let's hope that can happen. Get you over to Scotland, that would be fantastic. Okay, so I just want to thank Street Level for putting this event on tonight, and thanks to John for keeping an eye on all the tech issues. as always, Zoom. I can't wait till Zoom becomes that song again, as opposed to a practice that we have to continually use. So I just want to say thanks again to everyone for coming along tonight. Keep an eye on Street Level's website for all the future work that's coming your way, because it's amazing we're getting all this for free. So thank you all for coming.